Last time, we reminded ourselves who our storyteller is. He's eternal. He's experiencing past, present, and future at the same time. He has no limits in time and space. He's not dependent. He is the great reality. He owns everything. He's over everything. He writes the story as well as telling it. Before launching right into the narrative, let's remind ourselves about who, apart from God, was there at the beginning, at the start of the narrative. God had brought into existence an enormous number of beings. The biblical narrative doesn't focus very much on these beings that predate our world, but we get glimpses and clues which we can piece together into something of a composite picture. We'll do that briefly now because they do play an immediate role in the narrative itself. And they play a role today, anytime someone is hearing God's story. They are spirits. Again, what does that mean? It's our collective term for personal beings that are not limited to our physical world, to bodies. The narrative often refers to them, or to some of them, as angels. It's always worth stopping and thinking about words and terms we use and the ideas, the assumptions that cluster around them. To think about terms, words like spirits and angels and the images, the concepts that have been attached to them by popular culture. And we should try to identify and put aside those assumptions so that the biblical narrative itself shapes our understanding of the role of these beings and that we're not being overly influenced by other assumptions. A few things we do know about them from the Bible. As we've said, they predate the world, the physical universe we live in. We're told the angels were witnesses to its creation. We know that there are lots of them, perhaps millions. They don't have bodies like ours, but at least some have the ability to appear in our physical material dimension. Because they were created like us, they're dependent, they're contingent, they're not eternal, in other words. And of course, because it was God creating them, they were all originally perfect. They have personality, they're not robotic or controlled. We'll see this emerge from the narrative. To personal beings God creates, he gives real freedom to choose whether they'll listen to him as God or go their own way. That's something we'll see repeatedly. So he gave these angels, these spirit beings, varying capabilities to fit the roles that he had for them. A whole range of power and knowledge, and also the capacity to rule. How or exactly what is not entirely clear to us. It's not explained to us fully in the narrative. But some at least have what's called dominion or influence, some level of control. Now, the greatest among these servant angel beings, as we know, was called Lucifer. He was also created perfect and given incredible abilities to lead in the responsibilities that God was giving to these spirit beings. There were multitudes of them, these angels, right there at the beginning, created by God. The story begins with a straightforward statement that when it all started was when God created the heavens and the earth. This, of course, is Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Doesn't start with once upon a time, but in the beginning, or to get things started. Of course, there is eternity as a backdrop, if you like, but really the story which God wants to tell us, which we can relate to, his interactions with us as a human race, it begins at that point. We're all only too aware of the starting points of stories, as told by others. For our society, that's primarily science, isn't it? We need to note that that story, along with its starting points, is the product of predetermined stances, a materialistic closed system. And the trajectories of their assumptions, people who tell and believe that stories, is a kind of faith. It logically points to that starting point. Big Bang, if you like, is a shorthand way of saying a beginning without a personal God. So God's story, the only one, as we've said before, who's qualified to tell the story, begins with him creating, when there was nothing physical, material, or nothing at all in existence. It's a very difficult concept for us from inside that physical material world to grapple with. But that's what this story is. It's God acting in a God way, from outside the bounds of what is otherwise possible. Remember, it's his story, his reality. So he made stuff where nothing existed. That's part of being God, being able to do that. Unique, of course, to him. Not even angels with all their spirit world understanding and abilities can do that. Job chapter 38 describes this creation and says that angels actually shouted for joy as they observed God doing this creation. It's beyond our human language's capacity, which reflects our mind's inability to begin to understand what power and knowledge this represents, this creation. To bring something into being where nothing existed, it involves knowing what stuff is in its very essence, and exhaustive understanding of things like energy and light and motion and matter and how they work together. If we could bring together for one instant all the information contained in all the books, all the websites, stored, archived in all the servers around the world, all the power in all the nuclear reactors, the electrical grids in the countries, the ships that are running on the ocean, if we could bring all of that together, all that information and power, it wouldn't even be a blip on the radar of God's knowledge and power. It wouldn't bring something out of nothing. That's his story. God telling the story, this is in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, describes the earth as created. The raw substance is there, but it's without order. It's swirling chaos, dark, empty, and lifeless. Water is covering the planet. It's uninhabitable. Not yet a fit place for anything or anyone. But his Spirit is there, ready to do what God, the three-in-one God, had planned from before the beginning. God knew where he would take this, where his story would go next.